Hey guys, tonight we're starting with a topic that sounds like it belongs in a bad medieval sitcom. Royal food tasters. Yes, entire human beings hired just to chew on chicken legs before kings did, in case somebody had slipped a little something extra in the seasoning. Not paprika, poison. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe tuck in with a snack that, hopefully, doesn't need pre-chewing by a terrified servant. Tonight we're floating through history to answer one question. What actually happened to these people, especially when they failed? What happened to royal food tasters after they failed? Let's start with the basics. Food tasters existed because rulers were paranoid. And to be fair, if you were a king in the Middle Ages, you probably had good reason. Assassination attempts weren't rare. What was rare, though, was actual food poisoning by design. It happened, but not nearly as often as kings feared. Still, fear isn't logical. So we got tasters. Picture this, a royal banquet, glittering hall, golden goblets, and some poor guy with a spoon, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, being told, "Go on, try the soup." He dips the spoon, he swallows, and then everyone stares at him for the next 5 minutes. If he stays upright, the king digs in. If not, well, let's just say the entertainment portion of the evening came early. So what happened when a food taster failed? Well, failed could mean a few things. Maybe they didn't spot the poison. Maybe they got sick and the king got sick anyway. Or maybe the king just thought they failed. And in monarchies, appearances mattered more than truth. Sometimes tasters were punished as conspirators. Because if the king died after you tasted the food, you were automatically suspicious. Maybe you took a smaller bite. Maybe you had an antidote hidden in your sleeve. The logic wasn't flawless, but royal paranoia never was. In some cases, tasters were executed along with chefs, cupbearers, or literally anyone who had touched the kitchen door that week. Harsh, but kings liked scapegoats. Other times, tasters just quietly vanished from records. Poisoning wasn't as traceable as it is today. So a king's upset stomach might get blamed on bad fish, rather than a failed servant. In those cases, tasters probably counted themselves lucky and moved on to the next risky meal. Their whole career was basically rolling the dice, day after day, and hoping their stomach wasn't the last line of defense. But tasters weren't just expendable. Weirdly enough, the job could carry prestige. In Rome, for instance, the pregustator, the official taster, was often a freedman or trusted slave. They lived close to the emperor, ate the same luxuries, and shared the same table. It was dangerous, yes, but also a sign of closeness. Imagine being both expendable and indispensable at the same time. Still, when things went wrong, you didn't want to be them. Which leads us to a few stories. Roman emperors and their nervous tasters. The Romans, of course, were obsessed with food, power, and murder, so tasters fit right in. Emperors were especially paranoid. And if you know anything about Roman history, you know they probably should have been. Take Emperor Claudius. Poor guy, not the most commanding presence. He limped, he stuttered, and his family didn't think much of him. Yet somehow he ended up on the throne. And surprise, surprise, he also ended up poisoned. The culprit? Most likely his wife, Agrippina the Younger, who wanted her son Nero to rule. Claudius had tasters, of course. But here's the catch. Agrippina arranged for the poison to be mixed into his favorite dish, mushrooms. Legend says the poison was so well prepared that the taster ate it too. But it didn't hit until later, after Claudius himself indulged. So both failed and doomed together. In other cases, tasters didn't even get a chance to help. Emperor Commodus, yes, the one who thought he was a gladiator, was so hated that multiple poisoning attempts happened despite his guards and tasters. Once, his sister Lucilla tried to off him with a poison platter. Didn't work because Commodus had the digestion of a sewer rat. But you can imagine the taster sweating through that shift. And then there's Domitian, notorious for paranoia. He had his food inspected, tasted, and guarded. And yet he was assassinated in his own bedroom by courtiers. Which makes you wonder, all that effort with tasters and he still fell to the more old-fashioned dagger. What this shows is that tasters were a safeguard but not a guarantee. Poison in Rome was often slow-acting herbs, minerals, concoctions that wouldn't kill instantly but after hours or days. meaning the taster might live long enough to give the all clear, only to keel over later. By then, it was too late for the emperor too. Basically, everyone lost. So what happened to tasters in these situations? Usually, they died along with their boss. If the poison worked fast, they collapsed first. If it worked slow, they shared the fate a little later. Either way, their job description didn't come with a retirement plan. Medieval feasts and nervous bites. Fast forward a few centuries, and Europe's medieval courts pick up the same paranoia. Kings and queens were constantly worried about poison. And with good reason, medieval medicine couldn't distinguish natural illness from poison half the time. If you got sick after dinner, it was just as likely to be chalked up to sorcery, bad humors, or someone slipping powder into your pudding. Food tasters became a fixture of courts. The role could be assigned to nobles, courtiers, or unlucky servants. And it wasn't just food, tasters checked wine, ale, and even communion bread. Because yes, even God's table wasn't safe from suspicion. Henry VIII of England, famous for his paranoia and ever-shifting moods, had multiple layers of protection. His kitchens were enormous, his ingredients controlled, his cooks sworn to secrecy. He also employed official tasters who sampled everything before it touched royal lips. Did it work? Well, Henry died obese and ulcerated, not poisoned. So technically, yes, unless you count slow suicide by roast beef. In France, things were similar. The position of Grand Decanson included tasting the king's wine. It was an honor if you ignored the risk of sudden, agonizing death. But hey, you got to stand close to the king. Nobles loved proximity. Sometimes, though, tasters themselves were accused of foul play. Because if you're the one in charge of checking food, you're also in the perfect place to tamper with it. More than one taster found themselves under suspicion when rulers died mysteriously. And since forensic science in 1300 boiled down to, did you look guilty while eating bread? Many tasters didn't walk away clean. So what happened when they failed? Again, often execution, sometimes exile, and sometimes nothing because everyone chalked it up to bad luck. Monarchs could be surprisingly pragmatic about their own survival. Well, the taster died, but so did I. So what can you do? Renaissance intrigues and royal paranoia. By the Renaissance, poisons became both more refined and more terrifying. Apothecaries could create colorless, tasteless concoctions that slipped easily into wine or soup. And royal courts loved intrigue, which meant tasters were working overtime. Take the Borgias, because of course we're taking the Borgias. Their reputation for poison is legendary, though often exaggerated. Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare were said to use a concoction called cantarella, a mysterious white powder that supposedly killed discreetly and effectively. Did their tasters fail? Probably. Or maybe the stories were propaganda. But either way, sitting at a Borgia banquet wasn't exactly restful. In France, Catherine de' Medici's court was infamous for rumors of poisonings. Catherine herself was accused, probably unfairly, of handing out poisoned gloves, poisoned books, poisoned literally everything. Her kitchens employed tasters, of course, but in an era where everyone suspected everyone else, the tasters themselves were often distrusted. Failures were punished brutally, sometimes by torture, since rulers wanted names, conspiracies, culprits. Imagine nibbling a tart and knowing it could lead to the rack whether you lived or died. Meanwhile, in England, Elizabeth I lived under constant threat. As a Protestant queen in a Catholic-leaning Europe, she was a prime target. Her meals were checked, her ale sampled, her desserts carefully guarded. Her tasters, ironically, often enjoyed better diets than most nobles. But if they failed, they risked being lumped in with conspirators, because a poison queen was unthinkable without inside help. So tasters lived on a razor's edge, trusted enough to eat for the queen, distrusted enough to die if she fell ill. Early modern survivals. Even as time moved on, the tradition of food tasters didn't fully vanish. In the 18th and 19th centuries, monarchs and nobles still employed them, though by now, poisonings were rare, and the practice was more symbolic. A reminder of old fears. Take Tsar Nicholas II. His court had officials who tasted dishes, though by then the likelihood of assassination by poison was slim compared to, say, revolution. Spoiler: tasters didn't save him from firing squads. Napoleon Bonaparte, paranoid as always, had a personal taster as well. Though frankly, Napoleon's real downfall wasn't poison, it was Russian winters. No food taster could help with that, and even into the 20th century, echoes remained. Adolf Hitler had a group of young women who served as his tasters. Margot Wolk, one of them, later described the terror of sampling his meals. Every bite could have been her last. Hitler, ironically, died by his own hand instead of through his food, which must have been grimly ironic for the tasters who risked their lives daily. From velvet doublets to lab coats, so here we are, coasting into the 20th century. The age of monarchs ruling with divine right was mostly behind us, but the paranoia around food never really faded. Because as long as power exists, so does the fear of someone slipping something nasty into your soup. And yes, even in the modern world, tasters didn't vanish. They just evolved. Let's start with Joseph Stalin, the man who managed to combine absolute power with absolute paranoia. Stalin was notorious for suspecting everyone: his generals, his friends, even his doctors, and yes, his food. Every dish presented to him was prepared by a select kitchen staff, then tasted by official testers before reaching his table. Here's the kicker: Stalin often had meals in different dachas, far from Moscow, and he made sure the kitchens there were equally locked down. He would sometimes wait long minutes after a taster tried something, just staring to see if they keeled over. Imagine that for a dinner atmosphere. Nothing like watching your boss silently count the seconds after you've eaten a spoonful of borscht. In the end, though, it wasn't poison that killed him. It was a stroke, which means once again, the tasters went through all that anxiety for nothing. Next, we drift back to Hitler's Germany. We touched on his tasters earlier, but it's worth revisiting. Hitler's paranoia was legendary, and he employed a team of women as his official tasters. They lived in constant fear, sampling every meal before it reached him. Margot Wolk, one of those women, survived the war and later described the experience. She recalled trembling with every bite, convinced that death was seconds away. And the bitter irony? Hitler himself died not from poison in his food, but by his own hand, hiding in his bunker. Which again, must have been some grim consolation for the tasters who risked their lives daily for years. Let's float over to the United States now. American presidents, starting in the mid-20th century, adopted their own version of the tradition. They don't have official tasters chewing away at their plates, but their food is guarded, inspected, and sometimes chemically tested before serving. The White House has strict rules about where food comes from, who prepares it, and how it's served. John F. Kennedy, for example, had his meals monitored by security staff. Richard Nixon, traveling abroad, once had entire kitchens secured just to make sure nothing suspicious entered his dinner. By the time Ronald Reagan rolled around, the Secret Service had essentially become the modern tasters. Not with forks in hand, but with background checks, sealed kitchens, and inspections. Royal households still carry shadows of the tradition too. Queen Elizabeth II, for instance, did not have a dedicated taster, but her staff followed rigid food protocols. Everything was sourced, prepared, and sealed under watch. State banquets often included dishes inspected ahead of time, with staff essentially acting as the symbolic guardians of the table. And even now, in the 21st century, leaders traveling abroad often have food flown in from home kitchens, guarded in secure containers, just to eliminate risks. Some even bring their own chefs who double as security officers. So while nobody's gnawing on drumsticks in front of the monarch anymore, the spirit of the food taster is still alive, hidden under the modern cloak of lab testing and food security. But let's be honest, the romance of it has faded. The medieval drama of a trembling servant chewing on a king's mutton before handing it over has been replaced by sterile checklists and sterile gloves, which, frankly, is probably much safer, but also much less entertaining. Because really, if you think about it, the history of food tasters is a history of misplaced effort. Monarch after monarch feared poison, created elaborate systems to prevent it, employed tasters who lived on the edge. And yet, most of them died of the same boring things as everyone else. strokes, infections, cancer, or just plain old age. The irony is delicious, and yet the role of the taster carried heavy symbolism. They weren't just human shields for royal stomachs. They were walking emblems of loyalty, submission, and hierarchy. Sitting at the table with the monarch, biting into bread before the king did, wasn't only about safety. It was theater. It reminded everyone in the room who was important and who was expendable. The food taster was a stage actor in the long-running play of monarchy, where appearances mattered almost as much as survival. So, what did happen to food tasters after they failed? Well, most of the time they didn't fail at all because poisoning was far rarer than the paranoia suggested. But when they did, when a monarch fell ill or died mysteriously after a meal, the taster was usually the first to suffer. Sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with punishment, sometimes simply by being buried alongside the blame. But more often, they faded into history unnoticed. Loyal, terrified, anonymous, chewing for safety, living in fear, remembered only in passing footnotes. But tonight, as you drift off, maybe think of them. The forgotten men and women who sat at the edge of history's grand tables, tasting soups and pies, knowing every bite might be their last. Not heroes, not villains, just weary stomachs in service of power, which, when you really think about it, might be the most human part of monarchy's entire absurd spectacle. So let's leave it there, with the clink of silver spoons, the hush of anxious banquets, and the long shadows of forgotten tasters. Sleep well, and may your dreams be poison-free.